In 2009, Scotland had a flooding problem it could not solve, so officials did something that seemed completely insane. They took 11 beavers, animals extinct in Scotland for over 400 years, and released them into a dying, treeless valley. Engineers called it pointless. Farmers predicted the animals would starve within weeks, but 11 became 50. 50 became hundreds, and the data that came back rewrote how Scotland thinks about rivers entirely. To understand what happened next, you need to understand something called shifting baseline syndrome. Every generation inherits a landscape and assumes it is normal. Scots who grew up in the 1900s thought straight, angry rivers were just how rivers worked. Their grandchildren assumed the same. Nobody alive remembered what these waterways used to be, because the thing that shaped them had been gone for 400 years. 10,000 years ago, Scotland's rivers did not behave the way they behave today. They were slow, winding, alive. Water moved through dense forests, spreading sideways into vast floodplains that absorbed rainfall the way a sponge absorbs water. Scotland once had an estimated 330,000 hectares of functioning wetland. Today, over 90% of that is gone. That is because beavers were everywhere. Every dam they built slowed water down, spread it sideways, and created pools and marshy floodplains that held water during floods and released it slowly during droughts. They were not just animals living in rivers, they were the architects of those rivers. Then came the centuries of destruction. Beavers were hunted to extinction in Scotland by the late 1500s, killed for their pelts, their meat, and a waxy secretion called castoreum that was prized across Europe for medicine and perfume. By 1900, only around 1,200 beavers survived across the entire Eurasian continent. In Scotland, they were simply gone. And without them, the rivers forgot how to slow down. Rivers straightened, and they cut deeper. They drained the land rather than nourishing it. Floods became more violent, droughts more severe. Every generation that followed looked at those angry, straight rivers and assumed that was just how rivers were. They had no reference point left to know otherwise. In the late 1990s, a small group of Scottish conservationists began asking an uncomfortable question. What if the flooding was not inevitable? What if 4 centuries without beavers had systematically broken something that engineers with concrete and steel could never fix? The idea was not unpopular. When the first formal proposal to reintroduce beavers was submitted to the Scottish government, it was rejected. Too risky, too experimental, too many unknowns. Farmers lobbied against it. Landowners wrote letters. Several prominent voices in the Scottish countryside called it an idealistic distraction from real flood management. The conservationists filed a second application. More detailed, more data, more carefully argued. It took years. But in May 2008, the Scottish government granted permission for something that had never been done before in British history. The first licensed mammal reintroduction on British soil. The decision was controversial from the moment it was announced. Farming unions issued statements. Local newspapers ran headlines about flooded fields and damaged crops. A group of landowners in Argyll formally objected, arguing that releasing large dam-building rodents into Scottish waterways was reckless and premature. The conservationists released the beavers anyway. In May 2009, 11 beavers captured from wild populations in Telemark, Norway arrived in Scotland. After weeks in quarantine, they were released into Knapdale Forest in mid-Argyll, a remote landscape of interconnected lochs and overgrown waterways in the wet west of Scotland. The monitoring program was extraordinary. Hydrologists from multiple universities installed pressure sensors and flow gauges throughout the stream network. Vegetation plots were mapped and tagged. Fish populations were counted. Camera traps blinked to life at dusk along every major waterway. An independent program was designed to run for 5 years, tracking every consequence the beavers produced. If the animals failed or caused more harm than good, they could be removed. Scientists expected modest results. Small ponds, a modest increase in wetland insects, the kind of slow, incremental change that takes decades to show up in data. What they got was something else entirely. Within 72 hours of release, rangers found the first dam, wedged between alder roots, mud, and sticks packed so tightly that the current had already slowed to a crawl. The beavers had worked through the night. By morning, the stream looked different. This became a pattern. Rangers arrived at dawn and found structures that had not existed the evening before. Each night, the dam stretched further. Each morning, the valley looked a little less like the one they remembered. By the second year, narrow channels that had rushed straight toward the loch had transformed into patchworks of pools, marshy flats, and braided rivulets. Rangers counted new dams each spring. At first, 3, then 5, then more than a dozen. Some stretched more than 30 meters wide. The Rangers' field notebooks filled with entries that read less like scientific records and more like dispatches from a transformation. New dam above Loch Coil Bar, 24 meters long. Side channel now flooded. Birch regrowth vigorous. Engineers who had spent decades designing concrete flood defenses now found themselves studying diagrams of mud and sticks. Not everyone was watching with wonder. In Tayside, where an unofficial beaver population had been quietly establishing itself from unauthorized releases, some farmers were furious. Lower pastures flooded. Field boundaries shifted. Trees along riverbanks came down overnight. Several farmers contacted authorities demanding immediate removal. One described waking up to find a drainage system his family had maintained for 3 generations completely backed up behind a beaver dam built in a single night. These were not unreasonable complaints. They were real losses on real farms. And for a moment, it looked like the opposition might succeed. Scottish Natural Heritage received formal complaints. Parliamentary questions were raised. A segment of the Scottish press ran stories framing beavers not as ecological heroes, but as agricultural vandals. The conservationists who had spent years fighting for reintroduction now had to fight to keep it. Then the University of Exeter published its findings. Analyzing over 1,000 storm events across 4 beaver sites in Britain, researchers found that beaver dams reduce average flood flows by up to 60%. In Devon, beaver-created wetlands were storing over 24 million liters of water, the equivalent of 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools, held back behind nothing but sticks, mud, and instinct. Storm flows were reduced by an average of 30% during heavy rainfall. The lead hydrologist reviewed the data logs and shook his head. Their computer models could not reproduce what had actually happened in the field. But the detail that stopped engineers cold was not the volume, it was the resilience. A concrete dam requires inspection, maintenance, and repair crews. A beaver dam, partially washed out by a flood, is rebuilt within days, stronger and better adapted than before. The beavers do not just build infrastructure. They maintain it, upgrade it, and respond to failure automatically. No human engineering system does that. And then came the salmon data, the result that nobody had predicted. Researchers had feared that beaver dams would block salmon migration and destroy one of Scotland's most important fisheries. Instead, they found juvenile salmon thriving in the cool, slow pools behind the dams. Water behind beaver structures runs 2 to 3 degrees cooler than in open channels, precisely the temperature young salmon need. Surveys found juvenile fish in places where none had been recorded for years. The beavers were not just solving a problem from the past, they were accidentally building climate infrastructure for a future nobody had planned for yet. In November 2016, the Scottish government made an announcement. Beavers could stay, permanently. The same institution that had rejected the first reintroduction proposal, that had spent years demanding data and monitoring and evidence, now declared beavers a permanent part of the Scottish landscape. In May 2019, the Scottish Parliament gave them European Protected Species status, the same legal protection afforded to bats, otters, dolphins, and wildcats. Some of the farmers who had complained loudest began applying for compensation schemes and beaver management support, practical acknowledgement that the animals were not leaving, and that coexistence was the only viable path forward. And in Tayside, where beavers had arrived without invitation and caused the most conflict, something unexpected happened. Researchers began documenting the same flood attenuation effects that Knapdale had shown. The unofficial population that had caused so much controversy was delivering the same results as the carefully monitored official trial. The data did not care about the politics. By 2020, Scotland's beaver population had grown to nearly 1,000 animals across more than 250 territories. Today it stands at over 2,000, expanding naturally into new river systems, appearing in catchments where nobody released them, following water into valleys that were ready for them even when the people managing those valleys were not. The pattern began repeating across Europe. In Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland, beaver populations that had been near zero a century ago now number in the tens of thousands. In every country, the same sequence: reintroduction, skepticism, data, silence from the skeptics. In February 2025, the UK government announced that wild beaver releases would be permitted across England. Wales is now considering its first releases. What began with a rejected application and a handful of determined conservationists has become a continental rethink of how rivers work. Return to that valley, the one that felt dead not so long ago. The water moves differently now. Pools shimmer where there was only dry, cracked earth. Willows have taken root. Dragonflies hover above water that did not exist 5 years ago. Plant species have increased by over 40%. Water voles are back, otters, barn owls, and beneath the surface, something even larger is shifting. Beaver wetlands lock carbon into waterlogged sediment instead of releasing it into the atmosphere. In a country bleeding carbon dioxide from degraded peatlands, that matters far beyond any single valley. None of this was inevitable. It required people who filed applications that got rejected and filed them again. Scientists who held their ground while farmers demanded the experiment be shut down. A government that eventually looked at the data and changed its mind. 11 beavers, hundreds of storm events, one conclusion that could not be argued with.